Welcome to Chapter 6, Enhancing and Validating Forms. When you complete this chapter, you'll be able to enhance form usability with JavaScript, customize browser-based HTML validation, and implement custom validation to check for errors and display error messages. Validation is the process of checking that information entered by the user conforms to a set of rules. For example, credit card information must follow a set of rules or standards to ensure the card number is valid. A form object represents a form element in HTML. The properties, events, and methods of a form object are used to access the form and its data with JavaScript. Table 6.1 shows some of the most commonly used properties of form objects. The autocomplete property enables autocompletion of previously saved form data by a browser when set to true. The elements property returns a collection of a form's elements. The length property returns an integer representing the number of elements in the form. And the noValidate property disables browser-based validation by a browser when set to false. Table 6.2 shows the event that the form object contains, which fires when a form submit button is clicked. That event is the submit event. Table 6.3 shows some of the most commonly used methods of form objects. Check validity initiates browser-based validation of form controls, returning true if all controls are valid. The submit method submits a form without the use of a submit button. The elements used for collecting data from the user within a form include input, select, option, text area, and button. Any of these elements can be used to accept data from the user. Table 6.4 shows several properties shared by elements used for collecting data within a form. Autofocus returns the value true if the HTML autofocus attribute is set, indicating that the element should receive the focus when the form is loaded. Placeholder returns the value of the placeholder attribute, which contains text to be displayed when a field has no value. Required returns the value true if the HTML required attribute is set, indicating that the control must contain a value before the form can be submitted. Validation message sets or returns the text of the message to be displayed to the user after a failed submit event if the field's validity value is false. The validity property returns the value true if the control value passes browser-based validation rules. The value property sets or returns the value of the control, and the willValidate property returns the value true if constraint validation is enabled for the control. Table 6.5 shows several methods shared by elements used for collecting data within a form. The checkValidity method runs constraint validation against a form element and returns a value of true if the value is valid. The checkValidity method returns the value of false if the value is invalid. The setCustomValidity message, which accepts one parameter message, sets the string message as the text to be displayed to users if the control value is found to be invalid. Passing a non-empty string sets the control's validity to false, and passing an empty string as the parameter sets the control's validity to true. Table 6.6 shows several events shared by elements used for collecting data within a form. The blur event is triggered when the focus leaves the element, meaning that the element is initially selected or contains the insertion point, and then another element is selected or contains the insertion point, usually by clicking another element or pressing Tab to move to another element. The change event is triggered when the focus leaves the element and the value or selected state of the current element is changed. The focus event is triggered when the element receives the focus, meaning that the element is selected or the insertion point moves to the current element, usually by clicking the current element or pressing Tab to move to the current element. The form change event is triggered when another control in the form fires a change event, and the form input event is triggered when another control in the form fires an input event. The input event is the value or selected state of the current element changes, and the invalid event is triggered when a control's value is found to be invalid during constraint validation. The code getElementsByTagName form sub0 refers to the form object in a document that contains only one form. However, the document object includes a forms array. The forms array contains all forms on a web page. The form object, in turn, has an elements array. This array contains objects within a form element. For example, to reference the third object within the first form in a web page, you could use document.formSub0.elements_sub2. Most form validation involves checking data that users have entered into input and text area boxes to ensure its accuracy. Oftentimes, it's useful to restrict the information entered by users into small, discrete lists that present only a limited number of choices. Let's take a look at an example. In the form in Figure 6.2, you'd want to ensure that a user's entry in the card type box is for a credit card that your company accepts. In Figure 6.2, the field set contains all input elements, which opens up the possibility of users misspelling a word or typing in data that is otherwise not valid. Using a set of option buttons instead for the credit card type, as in Figure 6.3, represents an advantage, because it reduces the likelihood that the data entered by the user is not valid. Figure 6.3 also contains two selection lists for the expiration year and month. This redesign decreases the amount of necessary validation on the data provided by users. Table 6.7 shows selected form elements for providing limited choices on web forms. One benefit of using these elements to limit the number of choices available to the user is to prevent users from entering data that isn't valid. Option buttons are used to display a small set of options at once from which a user can select one. The code to create option buttons is input type equals radio. Checkboxes are used to display one or more yes/no choices. The code to create checkboxes is input type equals checkbox. Selection lists are used to display a truncated list of options that's fully displayed when a user interacts with it. The code to create selection lists is select option value 1, option value 2, with the closing option and select tag for each corresponding opening, selecting, and option tag. Sliders are used to display a bar with an indicator that users can drag to increase or decrease a value. Sliders are used with min and max attributes to specify bottom and top range of a range supported in Internet Explorer 10 and later, and all modern browsers. The code to create sliders is input type equals range. Data lists are used to display a text box that suggests values from the data list elements as user types, but enables a user to enter a value not in the list. The code to create data lists is input type equals text, list equals list name, followed by data list ID equals list name, option value equals value 1, and so on for each of these successive option values, and finally a closing data list tag. In addition to providing users with limited sets of possibilities for different form fields, you can create JavaScript functions that reduce the likelihood of user errors when completing a form. Such functions, known as assistive functions, do not perform validation themselves. That is, they don't check user content for errors. Instead, assistive functions prevent users from entering erroneous data in the first place. Many types of assistive functions are possible. Which ones you implement depends on the design of your form and the type of data you're trying to collect. You can use HTML to set the default value for a selection list, but only to one of the menu options. However, you can use JavaScript to set the selected index property of a select object to -1, which corresponds to no selection. This ensures that any selection is made by a user rather than being the default value. Table 6.8 describes this and other properties of select elements that you can manipulate with JavaScript. The length property returns the number of option elements nested within the select element. The multiple property sets or returns a Boolean value that determines whether multiple options can be selected in the selection list. The options property returns a collection of the elements nested within the select element, and the selected index property returns a number representing the element number in the options collection of the first option selected in the selection list, or returns -1 if no option is selected. The size property sets or returns the number of options to be displayed at once, and the type property returns the type of selection list, which is either select 1 if the select element does not include the multiple attribute, or select multiple if the select element does include the multiple attribute. One common use of adding and removing options from a select element is to change the option shown in a list based on another selection a user has made in the same form. For instance, the 3 selection lists in the delivery date field set of the Sweet Flowers order form contains lists of months, days, and years. However, the number of days shown to users should depend on the selected month. For instance, if a user selects March, the selection list for days should display the numbers 1 through 31. However, if a user selects April, the days list should display only 1 through 30. Table 6.9 shows the properties of the option element. Default selected returns a Boolean value that determines whether the option element, representing the currently selected item, includes the selected attribute. The index property returns a number representing the element number within the options collection. The label property sets or returns alternate text to be displayed for the option in the selection list. And the selected property sets or returns a Boolean value that determines whether an option is selected. The text property sets or returns the text displayed for the option in the selection list, and the value property sets or returns the text that is assigned to the option element's value attribute. This value is submitted to the server. Another way that JavaScript is commonly used to improve form usability is to copy data entered in one field to another field that a user indicates should contain the same data. In fact, if you've ever placed an order online, you've likely used such a function to indicate that items should be shipped to the address you've already provided as the billing address. This feature is often linked to a checkbox labeled shipping address same as billing address, or something similar. When a user checks the box, the contents of all billing address fields are copied to the corresponding shipping address fields. An example of this behavior can be seen in Figure 6.10, where the billing address entries are copied to the delivery address section. Customizing browser-based validation. Historically, much of the JavaScript code written to validate web forms performed a number of common and important tasks necessary to validate text fields, such as ensuring that required fields were completed, or verifying that the entry in a specific field met the requirements for that field, such as being a number rather than text. In recent years, however, enhancements to HTML and to modern browsers have allowed browsers themselves to perform many of these validation tasks without any extra JavaScript. This type of validation is known as HTML5 validation, also known as browser-based validation or native validation. Table 6.12 shows HTML attributes used to set browser-based validation parameters. The form noValidate attribute toggles off validation of the form when added to the input tag for a submit button. The attribute is used with input elements with the type value of submit. The max attribute specifies the control's maximum numerical value and is used with input elements with the type value of number. The max length attribute specifies the control's maximum number of characters and is used with text area elements or input elements displayed as a text box. The min attribute specifies the control's minimum value and is used with input elements with a type value of number. The noValidate attribute toggles off validation of the form when added to the opening form tag and is used with the form element. The pattern attribute specifies a pattern that a control's value must match, expressed as a regular expression, and is used with text area elements or input elements displayed as a text box. The required attribute indicates that the control must have a value and is used with input, select, or text area elements. And the step attribute specifies the increment that a numerical value must adhere to and is used with input elements with a type value of number. Additional browser-based validation is linked to several values for the type attribute of the input element, which are described in Table 6.13. For instance, if a field is created with the tag input type equals number, modern browsers automatically reject non-numeric content. The color value is a number followed by a 6-digit hexadecimal color value with any letters in lowercase. For example, the # followed by FFCC00. The date, date time, week, month, time, and date time local values are relevant components of coordinated universal time UTC, a standardized date time format. For example, 2019-10-14T12:00.001-04:00. The email value is used for email addresses, for example, president@whitehouse.gov. And the number value is used for numerical values, for example, 73.54. Many aspects of the way browsers present browser-based validation feedback are customizable through the properties and methods of the Constraint Validation API or Applications Programming Interface. In addition to the validation message and will validate properties, which are described in Table 6.4, the validity object is also part of this API. The validity object contains several properties. If all of these properties have a value of false, then the value of the validity object is true. Table 6.14 describes the validity properties. The custom error property returns true if a custom error message has been set with setCustomValidity. The pattern mismatch property returns true if the control value does not match the value of the pattern attribute. The range overflow property returns true if the control value is greater than the value of the max attribute. And the range underflow property returns true if the control value is less than the value of the min attribute. The step mismatch property returns true if the control value does not conform to the value of the step attribute. The too long property returns true if the length of the control value is greater than the value of the max length attribute. The type mismatch property returns true if the control value does not conform to the rules for the type attribute value. The value missing property returns true if the control value is empty, but the control has a required attribute set. The valid property returns true if none of the preceding properties are true. The methods of the constraint validation API are check validity, which returns true for a control if the control value is valid, and set custom validity, which sets custom validation messages and rules. A description of these methods can be found on page 399 of the book. In addition, you can use the CSS invalid and valid pseudoclasses to change the properties of form elements based on their validity status. Let's take a look at an example. The JavaScript code here checks the value missing property of the fname element, and if the value is true, it sets the bubble text to "Please fill out this field." This bubble text would then be displayed consistently in all modern browsers. The addition of the following CSS sets the background of the field to a pink color as long as the validity state of the field is invalid. Figure 6.13 shows the results of this code when the form is submitted without a value for the first name field. Programming custom validation. The requirements of the form you're validating determine the kind of logic you need to incorporate into a custom validation program. However, a few types of validation functions are particularly common. These include checking that required fields contain entries, checking values that are dependent on the values of other controls, and checking for an appropriate content type in one or more fields. Validating submitted data. In chapters 1 and 2, you learned about many of the events that you can listen for in JavaScript. One event, submit, is available for use with the form element. The submit event fires when a form is submitted, which is generally when a submit button is selected on a form. A form's data is often verified or validated when the submit event fires, before the data is sent to a server. You use the prevent default method on an object to block the action normally associated with an event. You generally follow the prevent default method with the code that performs a different task for the specified event. In this case, the prevent default method stops the form from being submitted. You'll complete the function by specifying custom validation functions to run, and then you'll manually call the submit method to submit the form if the contents pass validation. Creating a function to validate required fields generally involves retrieving the values of the required fields and checking if the value of any of them is an empty string. For all custom validation, it can be helpful to use the try-catch structure you learned in Chapter 4 to handle and display error messages. The design shown here calls for a single error message to be displayed in a field set if any of the fields contain an error. For instance, to check if the input element with the ID value of first name is blank, you could use the following statement. If document.getElementById firstname.value strictly equals the empty string, followed by a code block to run if the field is blank. You can use a loop statement to check a group of fields and trigger an error message if any of them is empty. Instead of checking the value property as you do for a text input element, to validate whether a selection has been made in a selection list, you can check the value of the selected index property. Recall from earlier in the chapter that the selected index property represents the index value of the selected item within an array of the option elements. If no option is selected in the selection list, the selected index property for the select element is equal to -1. For instance, to check if the user has made a selection in the select element with the ID value state, and to alert the user if no selection has been made, you could use the following statement. If document.getElementById state.selectedIndex strictly equals -1, followed by the code block to run if the field is blank. In addition to both text boxes and selection lists, option button sets should be validated to determine whether they contain valid selections. To check if an option button is selected, you access the value of its checked property. To check if none of the option boxes in a set are selected, you can create a conditional statement using AND operators. For instance, to check if none of the 3 option buttons with the name color are selected, you could use the following code. var buttons equals document.getElementsByName color, followed by if not buttons sub 0.checked and not buttons sub 1.checked and not buttons sub 2.checked, followed by the code block to run if no button is selected. Figure 621 shows a flowchart diagram of a function called validateCreateAccount. If at least one field contains a user entry, all 3 fields must be completed. This means that if a user makes an entry in one field, all 3 fields become required. The values in the password and password verify fields must match. Because password entries aren't visible to users, browsers represent each character with a bullet by default. Requiring a user to enter the password twice helps ensure that the user has entered what they intended. Before we conclude, let's summarize. Validation checks that information conforms to a set of rules. Assistive functions reduce the likelihood of user errors. Browser-based, also known as HTML5 validation, is built into modern browsers and is customizable through Constraint Validation API. The prevent default method blocks actions normally associated with an event. To validate required text input fields, retrieve the values of the required fields, and check if the value of any of them is an empty string. To validate required selection lists, retrieve the selected index value and check whether it's equal to -1. To check if an option button is selected, access the value of its checked property. To check if none of the option buttons in a set are selected, create a conditional statement using AND operators. In some cases, you need to create validation functions to test the logic specific to your form.